1 year ago I tested NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode as well as AMD's anti-lag feature. What should have been a rather simple and straightforward test caused quite a stir, as my results contradicted the common belief that a higher frame rate always leads to less system latency and so a more responsive gaming experience. But before we dive into this further, let me make clear that today's video was not sponsored by NVIDIA or anyone else. I would like to thank my fine patrons for their awesome support, which made this video possible. Now let's get back on topic. On one hand, my tests confirmed what we expected. Both NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode as well as AMD's anti-lag slightly reduce the latency of your system when you are GPU bound. While when you are not GPU bound, they slightly increase the latency of your system. But the key finding of my tests was that the system latency is affected by the GPU load, and it increases significantly when your GPU is maxed out. So while both NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode and AMD's anti-lag do help a bit in a GPU-bound scenario, simply reducing the GPU load by using a good in-game frame rate limiter results in a much bigger delay reduction than what either of these features can do. So this video did get a lot of attention, because how could reducing your frame rate and so the GPU load lead to a significant reduction of the system latency when everyone agreed that more frames per second mean less lag? A lot has happened since I made that video. Sadly, I cannot share what discussions I had and whom I talked to. But what I can tell you is that NVIDIA took my findings seriously, and now 1 year later they released their low latency platform called Reflex, which is all about looking at system latency from a different perspective, where frames per second is no longer the only metric that matters. Now, the reason why a maxed out GPU causes the system latency to increase significantly is because the CPU then runs ahead of the GPU and piles up work in the render queue. When the render queue is full, then the CPU must wait around for the GPU to work on what the CPU put into the render queue. So that is where the back pressure and the increased system latency is coming from when you are GPU bound. The reason why a good in-game frame rate limiter helps here is because it basically creates a CPU bound scenario, which means that the render queue is always almost empty, as the CPU cannot run ahead of the GPU then. The GPU is just sitting there waiting to render what is prepared by the CPU. NVIDIA's ultra-low latency mode tries to mitigate the delay increase caused by the back pressure in a GPU-bound scenario. However, since the game is not aware of that driver feature, it cannot affect the pipeline on a level that would lead to a significant delay reduction when you are GPU-bound. With the new Reflex SDK, however, NVIDIA allows developers to implement a low latency mode which does not disable the render queue, but instead aims to keep it empty. This is achieved by enabling the game to better pace the CPU so that it cannot run ahead of the GPU, as well as allowing the game to send new frames to the GPU just in time to get rendered. So, very simply put, you can think of the Reflex Low Latency mode like a very good in-game frame rate limiter, but with the major difference that the Reflex Low Latency mode doesn't lock you at a specific frame rate, nor does it require any configuration. The Reflex Low Latency mode works like a dynamic frame rate limiter, which means that it tries to achieve the highest possible frame rate while preventing the system latency increase you will otherwise get in a GPU-bound scenario. If you want to know more about how it works exactly, then you can find a link to an article on the NVIDIA website in the description. Now, what do you need to take use of the Reflex Low Latency feature? First of all, it works with any monitor. Some people got confused by the announced 360Hz monitors which support the Reflex Latency Analyzer. These monitors allow you to measure system latency yourself, but you do not need such a monitor to use the Reflex Low Latency feature provided by game developers through the Reflex SDK. What you do need is a game where the developers added support for the Reflex Low Latency feature, and an NVIDIA graphics card where all GPUs starting with Maxwell, that's the GeForce 900 series, are supported. So in a game where the developer added support for the Reflex Low Latency mode, you will find 3 settings: off, on, and boost. Off and on are self-explaining. The boost option overrides the power-saving features of the graphics card, which causes the GPU clocks to stay high even when you are CPU bound. Compared to the on setting, the boost option can lead to an additional slight latency reduction, but it comes at the cost of the GPU consuming significantly more power, which means more heat and most likely more noise. The boost feature does the same as manually setting the power management mode in the NVIDIA control panel to prefer maximum performance. So that is why the Reflex Low Latency mode exists and how it works. Now let's see some test results. As you know from my previous videos, I measure the button-to-pixel delay or end-to-end system latency with a mouse which has an LED connected to the switch of the left mouse button and with a camera which records at 1000 frames per second. Inside the recorded high-speed footage, I look for the frame where the LED turns on, and then I count the frames until I see the action triggered by that input, which gives me the delay between the button and the pixel. This is an extremely time-consuming process, as you can surely imagine. Now, you might have already heard about NVIDIA's Latency Display Analysis tool, short LDAT. Again, I cannot go into too much detail here, but I've been testing this device extensively for quite a long time now. And while the included Logitech G203 mouse has slightly more delay than my G502, the results produced by LDAT are very close to what I get with my high-speed camera testing method, while it takes significantly less time. So as LDAT makes these tests a lot easier for me, and because my test showed that it produces reliable results, I will from now on mostly use LDAT for this kind of button-to-pixel or system latency test. Now let's finally see some test results. With my poor GTX 1050 completely maxed out at 70 to 72 FPS, I measured an average system latency of 57.7 milliseconds. With null enabled in the NVIDIA control panel, the frame rate drops to 67 to 69 FPS, and the average input delay is reduced by about 7 milliseconds. With the in-game frame rate limiter set to 60, the GPU load stays between 95 to 96%, and the average input delay is down to 35.7 milliseconds. So now I've just repeated the same tests I did in the video I mentioned earlier. Now let's see what happens when I enable the Reflex Low Latency mode. Compared to the GPU bound scenario, I lost 1 FPS and the GPU load was between 98 to 99%. The system latency was reduced significantly to 33.2 milliseconds on average. This means that just by enabling the Reflex Low Latency feature, the system delay is lower than what I got with the in-game frame rate limiter, while I get 10 FPS more. The boost option did not result in any noticeable change. It is possible that with other GPUs, games and resolutions, we might see some additional improvements with the boost setting. Now, what happens when you have null enabled and then also enable the Reflex Low Latency feature? In that case, Reflex takes priority and null doesn't have an impact. So, as more and more games hopefully start to add support for Reflex, and because null never really had much of an impact on the system latency, I'm not sure if there's much of a point to even keep that option in the driver. Next, what happens when you cap your frame rate at a value your system can always maintain, and then also enable Reflex Low Latency? Since a good in-game frame rate limiter and Reflex Low Latency both aim to keep the render queue empty, there is no point in using both at the same time. If you are after perfectly stable frame times, you will still use a frame rate limiter. But when you want the highest possible frame rate while not suffering from the system latency increase caused by a maxed out GPU, you will use the Reflex Low Latency feature instead of an FPS limiter. And lastly, does Reflex Low Latency affect the VSync delay? At 60 Hz I measured an average system latency of 95.7 milliseconds. With Reflex enabled, the system latency did not change, which is expected as we are not GPU bound when we use VSync. So with the Reflex SDK, NVIDIA allows game developers to implement an easy-to-use feature which keeps the system latency low while at the same time squeezing as much performance as possible out of the player's GPU, which I find very impressive. I'm really happy with what NVIDIA accomplished here, as well as their focus on providing both players and developers with the tools they need to achieve a fast, responsive and fluid gaming experience. For the future, I hope that the list of games which support the Reflex Low Latency feature will grow quickly. Personally, I would really like to see Overwatch support this feature as soon as possible. Since every game engine is different, you cannot apply the results from one game to another. I would not even apply the results from one Unreal Engine game to another, as games differ even when they use the same engine. And so I will do my best to keep testing the Reflex Low Latency feature in future videos, where I will then also test different hardware configurations and resolutions now that I have explained what the Reflex Low Latency feature is designed to do and how it works. I want to thank my fine patrons for their awesome support which made this video possible. And if you would like to join them, then you can find a link to my Patreon page in the description. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, ring the bell to get notified when I upload my next video, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris, and this was Battle Nonsense.